beginning to focus on the issue of major power conflict and plaudits for that. But I think that what's important to bear in mind, and I sometimes fear is a bit neglected, is that any such conflict, certainly if it actually happens, but even its preparation for it, what I like to think of as kind of imagined wars that shape the political sort of force field, the strategic force field between the major and among the major powers, is that any such conflict is going to operate under the nuclear shadow or may actually involve nuclear use. And I think that that's vital to bear in mind, but sometimes forgotten. The most obvious and in-our-face example these days is the Russia escalate to de-escalate strategy. The Russians have been thinking very clearly and very carefully about how to employ nuclear weapons in a limited, tailored way to try to favorably terminate a conflict. But the Chinese are also, I think less directly and less overtly, but they are also thinking about the role of nuclear weapons in a potential conflict. It seems to me their strategy is probably more to gain conventional superiority or even dominance in the Western Pacific and then shift the onus of escalation on us. But they're modernizing and, at least as far as we can tell, somewhat expanding nuclear force is going to give them more options for limited nuclear use. So any conflict that involves the United States and China or United States and Russia is going to involve nuclear weapons. For us to have an effective defense strategy to deal with this and to serve our traditional grand strategy, which I think we should continue, of extended deterrence, we need to figure out how to deal with this problem, grapple with this problem, rather than hope it goes away, which is, not unreasonably sometimes been our inclination the last quarter century. And I think that this means having a defense strategy that very clearly and practically has ways of plausibly deterring an adversary from using nuclear weapons, or God forbid, if they have been used, terminating their usage on terms that are sufficiently favorable to us. Now, the QDR of last year made noises in this direction when it said, we will not let an adversary escalate its way out of conventional defeat. Now, this is one species of the problem, and the QDR is to be commended for mentioning this, but I think it's well known that that was probably more of an aspiration than a reality in terms of defense planning and procurement and so forth. I think some initial steps in this direction are sort of de-ghettoizing the nuclear sort of thought within the Department of Defense and having a conventional nuclear integration, because this is how our adversaries are thinking about it. And I'll speak in a moment why I don't think that's destabilizing, but I think that's part of the beginning. But I think more broadly, and this is what I'm thinking a lot about these days, a lot of this is going to be thinking creatively, clearly, and carefully about the problem of limited war. That is, we are dealing with potential adversaries whose conventional militaries are extremely formidable and they're near abroad, and may be able to contest our ability to prevail, at least over certain time frames and under certain conditions, but also have survivable nuclear forces. In the case of the Russians, a very diversified and large nuclear arsenal. In the case of China, more significant long-term conventional challenge, probably, but with a more modest nuclear force if current trends continue. But I think the point of this is that we need to be thinking about how the United States and its allies can fight wars and can set and operate within the terms of limitation in a way that's sufficiently favorable that we achieve our objectives, but the adversary doesn't escalate in a way that puts the onus of escalation back on us. In other words, we need to be thinking about ways to fight, or have the Defense Department fight, in ways that push the onus of escalation on them, that put them in the situation where they are the ones who are being pressed to escalate in such a dramatic way. I want to emphasize that I think this way of thinking it sounds disturbing, Cold War, et cetera, to a lot of people, and in some ways, I can see that it is. But I think this is the best way to deter or prevent potential adversary aggression, coercion, or even use of nuclear weapons. I think in this audience, it will be less controversial to say that vulnerability creates its own challenges and its own form of instability. And I think that it's incumbent upon us that we should be strong, but not in ways that are unduly provocative, but in ways that counteract or could credibly counteract an adversary attempt to manipulate both conventional forces and nuclear forces. Let me give you a very clear example. In the Baltics today, the U.S. and NATO have a very modest force. The Russians, we've heard about the little green men. These are capabilities to create favorable political conditions. They also have a relatively formidable core of conventional forces that can be deployed very quickly and are very lethal and would pose a very severe threat for not just U.S. but NATO forces in general. And then they have a nuclear strategy where they're thinking about using limited nuclear threats or attacks to try to spook NATO into backing down. And just the other day, General Hodges mentioned that the Russians have been conducting mock nuclear exercises in Kaliningrad. So you're all familiar with this problem, but this is not a problem just of how do we defeat this adversary. It's also a problem of saying, how can we make sure that we have cohesion, that our use of force is seen as legitimate, is seen as less escalatory than the opponent? And I think this is important. Just wanted to touch a little bit on what Deputy Secretary Work said, because I think where he's going is absolutely right. But I do think we're going to need to think a bit more about what is the right standard for deterrence under what conditions. Deputy Secretary Work said, I think absolutely rightly, that the best form of deterrence is the evident ability to defeat the adversary. But what happens if the evident ability to defeat his adversary is either not plausible, which may be the case particularly in the Pacific if we don't get our acts together, but also if the only way to defeat them leads to them to escalate and leads them to escalate in ways that seem more reasonable. And for that reason, I think we need to be thinking about alternative mixtures of forms of deterrence. For instance, in the Baltics, my proposal is we should have a conventional force that is enough to make any Russian aggression in that area clearly brazen or costly. Bear in mind, that's not a tripwire, which I think is more where we're thinking today. But it's something bigger, but it's not something that would necessarily defeat the Russians on their own. But it's a way of saying, if the Russians go in, they will clearly be the aggressor, and that will legitimize our counter more effectively and more reliably. And I think this is the kind of thinking that we need to get back into, which is to think about limited war, to think about the political element of conflict in a way that is going to be uncomfortable for many in the defense establishment. But I think our adversaries are thinking that way, and we can't be put in a position where our lack of forethought about this allows them to get away with murder.
Well, as promised, I think you paint a very provocative picture there. And I think in many ways it goes against the thrust of some of the thinking that we've seen lately in the Obama administration. So I'd like to ask you a bit about investments, particularly as the United States has reduced its arsenal, its nuclear arsenal. As President Obama has made statements like the Prague speech in which he professed an interest in moving towards a world without nuclear weapons. How do you assess the current nuclear arsenal? Are there particular investments that you think we should be making? And how should we be integrating that into our broader capabilities?
Great. Well, no, thanks, Kelly. I mean, I think the first thing is to, again, this kind of conceptual piece, this organizational and sociological piece, which is integrating them so that nuclear does not seem like something that, oh, we got to that point, now we give it to Stratcom and they deal with it, they do whatever it is that they do. Rather, it's something that people are thinking about in the process of conceptualizing their O plans and thinking about the kind of procurements that they want to pursue or seek, that is involved in the development of policy documents, et cetera, et cetera. I think structurally, actually what I'm talking about does not involve radical shifts, either in conventional forces or in nuclear forces. On the conventional side, I think it's when we think about particularly high-end conventional systems, I think it means putting some degree of a premium on the capability to limit their employment in a way that's more favorable to us. That is, you don't want to run into the Schlieffen problem in some sense, that you don't want to, ordering the use of a certain capability inevitably renders a war more total. So, and we can talk about the specifics there. On the nuclear side, I think it's having preserving what capabilities for discrimination and tailoring that exist, which is a problem, especially in light of developing adversary air defense and other defenses. And expanding them where reasonable, short of doing something crazy, but basically having the ability to have the president be able to order relatively precisely a certain kind of strike and have that strike go as ordered. In a world where the B-2 and other kinds of systems are increasingly vulnerable to systems like the S-400, that's not something that we can necessarily bank on with existing technology. I also think it means having a nuclear command and control system able to do the kind of C4ISR, the battle damage assessment, et cetera, to put us in a favorable position should conflict ever escalate. The Russians should not be able to think that they can manipulate the ladder of escalation better than we can. That's not to say that we are enabling this kind of conflict. It's to say, Russia, China, you can't put us in a position where we don't have an appropriate response, even though we're fighting over a territory that's 5,000 miles away from us. So those are the. But again, in terms of numbers, I don't think what I'm saying involves a radical change. I would also shift the way that the country talks about nuclear weapons. I think, the goal of abolition is a laudable one in many respects, but I think that we are entering a period of major power competition and potentially, God forbid, conflict. So I think we should talk about things more like stability, like the responsible management of the absolute weapon, of these perilous and dangerous and horrible weapons, and speak frankly about them, but not give the impression that we are trying to reduce their role necessarily. We may try to minimize their role, but recognize that there's a certain equilibrium that will exist based upon the strategic situation that exists.
Jerry, I'd like to ask you the same question with regard to conventional capabilities. You recently released a report, Retreat from Range, that's looking at the decline in range in the carrier air wing. And I think you alluded to some of the deficiencies in U.S. military capabilities as you see them. But what kinds of investments should the United States be making in order to ensure that it's prepared to operate in this environment that we've been discussing?
Well, there was three major themes that that emerged out of the report as I did the historical research in the back of it, was that the defining characteristics of the air wing, that as they emerged in the 1930s during the period of fleet experimentation, were mass, meaning the size of the air wing, how many airplanes can I actually put on the aircraft carrier's deck, how much ordnance can they carry or payload capacity, and then how far can those aircraft in mass carry the payload to be able to have an effect upon the opposing enemy fleet or, for that matter, enemy land forces. And that's governed the evolution of the carrier air wing throughout most of its history until we essentially reached sort of the post-Cold War era. And then we began to make a series of decisions. One saw the decrease in range as the A-12 program was canceled and the A-6 naturally retired. And then also some decisions we made with regard to a flat budget. When you have a procurement that's flat, but you have a steadily increasing cost per unit, then we actually saw the size of the air wing come down. So for instance, when I deployed on board a nuclear aircraft carrier in the early 1990s, we had an air wing that was about 84. At one point in time, we had an air wing that was 94 aircraft. Today, the air wing ranges between 62 and about 72 aircraft. So we've seen the overall size come down. But we're facing an environment right now where numbers matter. I mean, it not only matters with the carrier air wing, it matters with the size of the fleet. It matters with the size of the Army, as General Milley spoke of this morning, so far as number of units in contact is something that we have to pay attention to, because you cannot be virtually present when it comes to some of these operations. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything has to be manned. I think that there is a role for manned, unmanned, and we do have to find some way of breaking that cost curve to be able to grow the size of the military. I think that there's a classic strategy, in fact, a strategy that emerged during the end of Vietnam. We were still actually in Vietnam, recognized that we saw some budget decreases coming, and we went with a high-low mix. And in fact, the F-18 Hornet and the F-16 came as matching aircraft in line with the F-15 and the F-14, that we knew that those were going to be very high-price units that we couldn't purchase in large numbers. So we had to purchase these other aircraft in higher numbers so that we could sort of fill out the air wings of those days. And so that high-low mix, that ability to vary your purchase in order to maintain the aviation fleet size in that case, and I think that we could do a similar thing with the surface fleet by making alternative investments that we could rapidly grow back above 300 ships. My estimates, actually, when I still worked in OSD policy while I was on active duty, was we had an actual requirement of about 350 ships. Now we seem to be hoping we can get to 308. So I think we're going to have to use some alternate acquisition strategies to do a mixture of high-end, exquisite technologies and low-end capabilities to come in matching pairs. There's a lot to be said with Hornets that are carrying a boatload of weapons that are operating in conjunction with the Joint Strike Fighter in some sort of a networked environment, or for that matter, manned and unmanned teams that are able to carry things in greater distances. And so those are the types of innovative strategies I think that are begging us to pursue at this point in time. We just need to break out of sort of the calcified thinking that's dominated us for the last generation.
Mike, I'd like to ask you some about investments in emerging technologies. The offset strategy is something that's come up several times today. Secretary of Work mentioned his approach to the offset strategy, as did General Milley. As you're thinking about these technologies as a whole, are there particular areas that you think are particularly promising in terms of strengthening deterrence and that we should be investing in more heavily so that we're better prepared for the long term?
I think consistent with what Bridge and Jerry both said, they both emphasized in different sorts of ways decline in numbers that we've seen over time and a growth in quality. And this is consistent if you, again, go back to the end of the Vietnam War and the end of conscription and the shift to the all-volunteer army, what do you see then? You see an increase in the investment in people, because you need to essentially pay for your people in a way that you didn't have to before, and an increasing emphasis on a smaller number of higher quality platforms. And that has been the fundamental basis of American military superiority ever since then. But if you think that a new generation of technologies, and not just robotics, but also you can think about cyber here, you can think about human performance in synthetic bio, you can think of a bunch of different areas. If the underlying basis of these technologies is going to spread around the world much more quickly, then the underlying basis of US military superiority also will have to change at least somewhat. In that investing in a small number of high quality, very expensive systems isn't necessarily going to do it. And there's no better area where we see this in some ways than the debate about the U-class, the Navy's next generation unmanned carrier air system. This is in line in some ways with what Michelle Flournoy was saying this morning about defense reform, and that it gets to acquisition reform. And that there's the debate that's been going on for several years now about whether the Navy should buy the more advanced version of the design a more advanced version of the U-class that can operate in an A280 environment, or whether it should essentially develop a Reaper on a boat. And both of those are useful capabilities that the Navy could, and I'm being a little pejorative in the way that I describe Reaper on a boat, but both of those are useful capabilities that the Navy certainly can and needs and should use. The problem is that the way that our procurement and acquisition system is built now, we basically only get one shot at it. We'll build one of those. It'll take us, however long it takes to do that, and then what happens after that? If our decision cycles need to speed up because new technologies are spreading more quickly, that means that our acquisition system also needs to speed up. And so these one-size-fits-all sort of 30 years military procurement systems can't necessarily be the way that the US does business in a world of emerging technologies. So rather than basically putting, if you think about it from a poker perspective, rather than pushing all of our chips to the middle on one version of the U-class or another, just to stay on that analogy, what the US needs to be doing more, and it's why I was heartened to see Deputy Secretary Work talk about experimentation, is making a larger number of small bets on future technologies that the United States is then able to take advantage of as the security environment evolves. Since it's hard to tell what have the last 15 years taught us, if anything, then frankly, we're not always the best at predicting what the future security environment's going to look like. 4 or 5 years ago, thinking about Russia invading a sovereign country and Russia seeming, and what Russia's doing in Syria didn't necessarily seem like the highest issue on the US foreign policy agenda. Now, things are very different, as Bridge was describing, and we have to rethink the way what the nuclear conventional mix potentially looks like in deterrence in a new era. Precisely because of that uncertainty about the future security environment, combined with these shifts in the speed with which technology is evolving, especially getting into things like machine learning and artificial intelligence and other areas, we need to be more agile. And agility in this case means not placing really large bets on a small number of systems, but instead retaining the ability to innovate faster and to build essentially smaller numbers of systems with shorter production cycles in a way that does potentially shift the cost curve a bit when it comes to future military systems. And this will not be easy, in large part because this runs against, going back to what Jerry mentioned about culture before, goes against the bureaucratic culture of a system that's been designed essentially to do the opposite over the last 40 years, to build a small number of the best military platforms in the world and pair those with the best people. We don't only need to make sure we still have the best people in the world moving forward, which of course is priority number one. We also need to ensure that the way that we're developing these platforms is in line with the way that technology is changing.
So I'd like to open it up to the audience. But before I do, I have a quick question, because all three of you mentioned some major impediments to some of the proposals that you made, and Mike just gave us one of his ideas in terms of making small bets for overcoming some of these impediments. Are there other types of actions that we could undertake that might help us along?
Well, I think that one of the things the Secretary alluded to this morning is something we ought to look at, which is reigniting that experimentation loop that goes on between the building, going on with universities like the Naval War College or the Air War College, and then industry and our laboratories. So that ideas are being tested. A lot of the things, one of the reasons, I always harken back to the F-100 series or the Century series of aircraft and how quickly you developed a number of different iterations during the late 1950s, 1960s. But a lot of that's been overtaken by computer simulation and modeling, and so I understand that, and there's a place for that in the experimentation cycle now, but that should be taken up in places like the labs, with DARPA as well, but it needs to be integrated at the War College and then it needs to be integrated back in the OpNav. Right now the loop seems to be broken, and right now the loop seems to be back and forth between the Hill and the Pentagon in a ping pong match rather than sort of an outreach. And so I think that reigniting that experimentation loop and re-energizing it would be a good way ahead.
I guess I'd just say for the kinds of issues that I'm thinking about, or the kind of broader issues, I think the recognition that in the foreseeable future the United States could lose a potential conflict against a very serious adversary under the conditions that I'm the types of conditions I'm kind of talking about. Because I think once there's that recognition, I don't think it's yet the case in the broader defense policy conversation. Then people will say, well, oh wait, we really do need to do these different kinds of things because it's more important because this really catastrophic thing could actually, and I'm not talking about marching into Washington, but I'm talking about limited conflicts where an adversary does have a strategy for cutting the thing off before we are able to respond or want to respond sufficiently. And that's why I think what the Deputy Secretary, Undersecretary Kendall, Secretary Carter, Secretary Hagel, and General Breedlove and others, what they're saying is true. There are people, sometimes hear it in Europe, don't exaggerate the problem, don't exaggerate the threat. And it's true that you don't want to give the Russians, the Chinese, or others more of a appetite. But I think that there's, they see what we're doing, but I think it's more important in our own conversations, being the political system that we are and that our allies are, that we understand how serious this problem is and that it's getting worse. You look at the RAND scorecard report on China and it's heading down. You look at Undersecretary Kendall's charts in space, maritime, et cetera, and it's a really sobering picture, and I think that has implications across the force, but also in the conventional nuclear piece.
Great, well, let's open it up for questions. If you could please wait for the mic to come to you, and then please also introduce yourself. There's our mic, right?
Thank you. I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School. I recognize this is primarily a conference on what I'm going to call technology, but it seems to me the biggest problem we have is we don't understand the other. And it was easy when I came to the Defense Department 38 years ago. It was the Soviet Union. We understood how they spoke, how they thought, what they would do, and they did the same for us. I don't consider that a large part of the problems that we're facing today. How do we build that into our education and training and what I would hope would be a learning organization? Now, maybe you're the wrong people to ask, but I think it's a subject that we have to address in a very broad way.
Jerry, do you want to tackle that one?
So I'll start because I think actually all of us, would look at this as what a learning organization is in a different perspective. So, as a lifelong devotees of the humanities, after my failure of Calculus 1 at Purdue in the aerospace engineering program, when I became political science major, I've been in love with ideas of people and cultures and interactive groups and organizational behavior, and that really has characterized most of my study and research over the years. And so, one of the things that I have always enjoyed is the exploration of the other, which goes into their cultures and their viewpoints. And again, I've always been skeptical of sort of the U.S. view that everyone wants to be like us, and the fact is they don't. Most of the countries that I've traveled to, sometimes at their invitation, sometimes not at their invitation. Most of the people that I've dealt with did not necessarily want to be like me. They did not want to wear blue jeans and listen to John Cougar Mellencamp song. So
That might be you, though.
that could have been me. And also, you know, like food. I mean, I don't understand a lot of foreign food. But that being said, you know, so I think that we have to be more respectful, actually, of the viewpoints and the challenge those viewpoints represent, in that, you know, a lot of our ideas that comes out of our own particular cultural experience don't naturally translate, nor are they naturally adaptable. So I think that that's important as we consider strategy. This comes back to what I was alluding to after Mike's initial comments here. I'm not sure that the Russians want to be precise. I think that there's an aspect of the way the Russians wage war that says, I'd like to be indiscriminate, and I like people to be a little bit more fearful. We actually want to garner people's respect and admiration and their affection. We want them to be like us. I'm not sure that the Russians really move in with that type of a perspective, nor do I think that translates, quite frankly, with the Chinese. You know, our views on the individual and the importance of the individual in our culture doesn't necessarily translate within their culture. How do we take that into account in war and strategy? And those things have to be brought up. You know, with regard to learning organizations as to how technology, I'm the wrong guy to ask about that. You know, it was difficult enough for me to learn the technology I was presented with in my career, but I think Bridge and Mike perhaps could take that up.
I think the learning of technology is easy, the learning about others is hard.
Yes, sir, right here. It'll be helpful for our webcast.
Good afternoon. I'm Stu Braden. I'm with the Global Special Operations Foundation. In recent years, we've seen a massive growth in special operations worldwide. Everybody seems to be doing it. The UK just doubled their budget to their special operations. How do you account for that growth of special operations in the future, current and future operating environment?
I think the growth in special operations has been one of the most interesting trends in militaries around the world, you know, including, as you alluded to, but certainly not limited to the United States military. And in some ways, from the perspective of some of the things that we're talking about, the special operations forces embed a lot of the qualities that we want to be in our broader military services, and that they're a little more agile, for example, able to deploy new technologies a little bit faster, and a little bit more organizationally nimble. Since while a lot of this panel has been about technology, technology is only useful, I'll repeat this, technology is only useful when it's used by highly trained people and with operational concepts that help you achieve your objectives. And it's those things in combination that have, say, made the United States military and U.S. special operations, you know, special forces, the best in the world. And so I would expect in some ways the role of special operations from going back to technology from a technology perspective as an incubator to continue, and particularly for, you know, the sorts of technologies that are, you know, can be sized for special operations units. But at some point, I think to the extent the growth of special operations will, you know, whether it continues or not, I think that has much more to do probably with the evolution in the future security environment as anything, and that the more those sorts of forces are seen as the optimal sort of instrument to employ in a particular conflict, the more we're likely to see them grow. But I suspect the rest, we might see some growth in the rest of the world, since Jerry's right that, you know, not every, you know, say the Russians not always using precision strike reflects that their interests in when they use force might be slightly different than the United States in some cases, but mimicry certainly happens. And to the extent that the countries in a military sense sometimes do wish to emulate the American model, I think you do see a little bit of that in the growth of special operations forces.
I would jump on that too, to point out that essentially with the advent of the nuclear weapon and strategic deterrence that goes along with that, it's opened up, the middle ground has been kind of vacated. In that even though we like to size our large land forces for the big Fulda-Gap battle or the maneuvers in the desert and so on, the fact of the matter is both Vietnam as well as our last 11 years, 14 years of experience have really been counterinsurgency soft-like operations. And so that occupation that we have with the strategic sense that, you know, going big in war really, you know, ends up in places we really don't like to talk about. has driven us towards this. The difficulty I have is that despite both of those long experiences in Vietnam as well as in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's seeming as soon as we can get ourselves out of that, we want to get our force back to sort of planning force structure and force size towards large maneuvering combat elements, and that is unwise. I would say that one of the things that struck me was that naval forces tend to think more almost soft-like in the sense that we're always out, we're always deployed, we're always in the neighborhood, we get to know people, the local actors, and we tend to interact on a more consistent basis, which is more in line with soft doctrine than perhaps the large land battle doctrine.
Yes, ma'am?
Okay, strategic deterrence in a new era. I wonder if the new era is possibly a little ahead of what we've been describing here, and that's been reaction to Iraq, the Russians, the Ukraine, that kind of thing. If you've been listening to Ted Koppel, if you've been hearing about the homegrown, now being called terrorist attacks on the home front, and that was not just the recent one, it was also Boston, there seems to be a great possibility, as I see it, for just a tremendous upheaval over something that doesn't seem to be getting a lot of attention in terms of deterrence. My confusion is there a line, is there a specialty between home front security to protect us from this versus the military? And how do we look at it? If I'm reading things correctly, the new era is in these little pockets that can just cause havoc. If our grid, our electric grid, our transportation grid goes under, it can paralyze the entire country here. I'm curious to get some response on that, please.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, look, we're dealing with a multifaceted security environment, threats coming from a number of vectors. I mean, I think the way, and this actually is apropos of the Special Operations Forces, my main sense, and Deputy Secretary of Work has been writing along these lines for a number of years, including before he went into government, but we're probably going to be dealing with kind of several categories of challenges, one of which is radical Islam and the kind of terrorist threat, including potentially weapons of mass destruction or mass effect, including potential cyber capabilities if they're able to be used at that scale, but also more traditional weapons of mass destruction. But at the same time, we're going to be dealing with great power dynamics in a more competitive geopolitical environment. I mean, I think the probability of an attack by radical Islamic terrorists or other kinds of terrorists is obviously a lot higher. But the scale of the potential cost of a major war between the United States and Russia or the United States and China dwarfs that the kind of median kind of threat from a radical Islamic source. I think the bottom line is we're going to have to do both, and my sense is that we should focus our capabilities on maintaining our conventional and our strategic advantages where possible to continue to sustain our sort of what we used to call the free world from attack or coercion, which is in high-end conventional forces, nuclear forces, aerospace dominance, et cetera, and at the same time invest in special operations forces, intelligence capabilities, law enforcement, partnership building, et cetera, designed to both deter, negate, eliminate, et cetera, threats from radical sources that are likely to persist for the foreseeable future, unfortunately. So we're going to have to degrade and destroy where we can and contain where we can. So I think the bottom line, though, is we're going to have to, I think what we're talking about here is a subject that in these kinds of quarters gets a hearing, but in the broader political conversation tends to be drowned out, unsurprisingly and in some degree legitimately by these concerns about radical Islam, and these are very, very serious and need and require very focused and serious attention. But on the other hand, when we're thinking about our national strategy, what doesn't quite make the news on a day-to-day basis may actually be more consequential in certain ways in terms of our budgetary decisions, in terms of our policy, and in terms of the most risky and costly potential outcomes.
Yes, sir, right here in the front.
Last question.
You have the honor of being our last question.
Lucky me. Cameron Luthy, Bloomberg Government. In the late 70s, early 80s, as our conventional forces improved in their capabilities, that was seen as contributing to a more stable deterrent capability. So my question for the panel is, if we are going to improve our conventional forces, is that stabilizing, or does it have a risk associated with it?
Very, very interesting question. I think stability is something I've thought about a lot, and the notion behind strategic stability and stability of all kinds is that two powers that are in some degree of hostile relationship can find some basis for stability, for a tolerable equilibrium that is somewhat flexible and plastic enough to adapt to geopolitical conditions. Of course, in practice, usually one side or both sides are seeking advantage and so forth and so on. I mean, in the 1970s and 1980s, I think it's worth remembering that it was assumed well into the 1980s that the Soviets could be at the English Channel in the course of about 3 weeks. So a lot of what the conventional deterrent in practice was oriented towards was raising the threshold, in a sense doing what I'm talking about with the Baltics, which is to say maybe there was a vision that in the 1990s or 2000s, the United States and NATO would be able to actually defeat the Warsaw Pact in an out-and-out conflict, assuming the pact didn't just dissolve on contact. But I don't think anybody ever really thought that air-land battle was still kind of a series of charts in the middle 80s and stuff like that, follow-on forces attack. Yeah. But it was successful in the sense that it freaked the Soviets out along with SDI and stuff like that, and the deployment of the Glickums and Pershings. I think in that sense it was stabilizing in the way that today things will be stabilizing, because it was intended to plug a hole. And the hole that the Deputy Secretary of Work recognized or pointed to was the advent of parity. And basically, NATO had been the one that would say, if you cross the inter-German border, we're going to blow up the world. Or, for Morton Halpern's line, first we'll fight conventionally until we lose, then we'll fight with limited tactical nuclear weapons until we lose, then we'll blow up the world. Right? It's not a very credible strategy when the adversary has a retaliatory capability. The improvements in the conventional capability stabilized, from the Western point of view, the situation by making it much less attractive for the Soviets too. I think today we face a situation in which the Russians are nowhere near the Red Army, but NATO is nowhere near where NATO was. I mean, there was an article, I think General Scales put it in the journal, that even US forces in NATO don't have basic air defense capabilities. I mean, they have, I think, TMD kind of capabilities, but they lack shorter range air defense capabilities. American forces have not fought without air superiority since probably at least Korea, maybe World War II. This is a situation in which the Russians have very formidable air defenses and strike capabilities of their own. Meanwhile, the Germans are practicing doing military exercise with broomsticks. I mean, it's an unfair story, but there's also a lot of truth in it. So, I mean, what I worry, and I sometimes think, am I talking about the Baltics too much? But then I think, wait a minute, the Russians could be there very quickly, and the Americans, in order to fight back, would have to suppress enemy air defenses on Russian sovereign territory, would have to blow a lot of things up, would have to be doing a lot of nasty stuff, and it would take us quite a bit of time, and would the NATO allies be going along? So I think the stabilizing thing is to plug, if not fully plug, make that hole a lot less attractive. So I think it's stabilizing. I'm sure the Russians have a different view, but I'm sure I'm right.
I would also say it's kind of interesting to, because history being 2020, we look back at the late 1970s, early 1980s as this period of stabilizing. And the fact, as probably the only person on the stage that actually, can remember that time frame, it was a time of a lot of instability. And in fact, we know from looking at the Soviet archives that, Andropov was convinced that Reagan was going to come in 1983 and that we were going to go into all-out nuclear war at that point in time. So the contemporary account of the era was that it was a very destabilizing era because of the rapid, growth of our buildup. And I think it's interesting that as we, if we take the DefSecDef snap of the chalk line from 2013, 2014 as this kind of turning point, to keep in account that, the strategic deterrent era, the containment era, was never as clear, to those who were participating in its formulation as what it appears to us now in hindsight. And so as we feel our way through, not into a great power competition between us and the Soviet Union, but actually at least a three-legged stool right now between us, China, and Russia, If Europe can manage to get its game together and step it up above 2% of GDP, then maybe they can play in this too. Then I think that we're still trying to figure out what the new equilibrium point is going to be as we go through some sort of a buildup. That buildup may be in high tech, that may be built up in more broader generic forces. We don't know how to characterize that yet. I appreciate the leadership and vision that DefSecDef work is coming, and I do hope, as he essentially asked today, that whoever the next administration takes up this initiative and continues to move it forward, I think it's the only responsible thing to do from a bipartisan standpoint, that we need to move forward with some of these initiatives.
I would just say that I think the whole now is the risk of self-deterrence, because we risk that others are catching up in a way that thus makes the U.S. less comfortable with deploying certain assets, with potential A2AD scenarios in the Pacific being, with the carrier and in China's developing anti-ship ballistic missile being an example of this. And so the development of new conventional military technologies, I think, is unlikely to be destabilizing, except insofar as adversaries would rather the U.S. didn't have great military tech. I mean, of course, but it will be stabilizing insofar as it fixes a genuine capabilities hole that seems to be developing that could make it a lot harder for the United States to execute its strategy and project power around the world.
Well, I know that there were a number of other questions, and I apologize that we weren't able to get to all of them, but I'm afraid our time is up. Thank you very much for joining us, and please do stay with us for the preview of Citizen Soldier.